I'm looking forward to introducing to you Dr. Sharon McGuinness, who's returning home. She's more of a right to be here than I have. And to her it's great to have her here as she enters her new post as Executive Director of the European Chemicals Agency. A great, I think, plaudit for her and for Ireland. So I want to welcome Sharon to the stage.
I'm delighted to be here speaking to you on a topic I think that is getting, obviously, it's always been of importance to those of us in the area, but I think the whole point about health and the environment and the connection to people's life and working life and living life is getting more and more important, and it's good to see it spreading. So maybe just a little bit of an introduction to who the European Chemicals Agency are. You might not have heard of us up until now. We're an agency, an EU agency based in Helsinki. We were set up about 2007. And the reason we were set up was to take account of a new piece of legislation called the REACH regulation, which stood at the time for registration, evaluation, authorization, and in small brackets, restriction of chemicals. And we've been there a long time doing that work. And as with any agency in any place, including here in Ireland, you tend to get more things as you go along. So we've gathered different tasks and different pieces of legislative mandates over the years, and I'll talk a little bit about them. So one of our, and as an agency, I just, maybe to point out that we're also part of a network of EU agencies. And as an executive director, that we have a session and meet on a regular basis with what we call our partner colleagues in the environmental field. So those are that's the EEA, the European Environmental Agency, the ECDC, we have EMA, the European Medicines Agency, and EFSA. So we all have a contribution to make to protecting health and the environment across Europe, and we all try and work together, which I think is, if we're ever going to deal with all these large problems that are coming at us and all the challenges we have, more and more working together is going to be absolutely essential. So apologies if some of you know this stuff already, but I just thought it might be helpful to maybe talk about what we do in Europe and how we approach managing and using chemicals safely. And obviously, and this really comes from that change in legislation REACH back in 2007, where we now require companies to provide the information proving their chemicals are safe, and they must register and they must do various tasks. And then ourselves as an agency, together with national authorities, and here in Ireland those authorities include the EPA, the Health and Safety Authority, and also colleagues in the Department of Agriculture who deal with biocides and pesticides, check the information, they identify harmful chemicals, they propose ways to regulate, and then they do the various checks. So still on the ground at a national level, member states are checking. And when we come out in the agency and we look at a chemical, we've gone through various stages, we may deliver what we call an opinion, which is usually based around scientific or technical information, or a decision. Now, those go forward and then it's brought through at EU and member state level for a decision. So there's a very kind of that looks like it in simple terms, but as you can imagine, nothing is simple when it comes to legislation. But it does show that, back in 2007, there was a real push to make sure that we had sufficient information on the chemicals we had in the market, that A, we knew what chemicals were on the market, and B, we had sufficient information. And if there was a problem, we were going to be able to address it. And that's what the agency and ECHA and other members and member states have been doing over the last number of years. So don't worry about the big diagram here, but if you kind of look up here, so managing chemicals really is at the core, is REACH, this regulation, but also the classification, labelling and packaging regulation, which identifies, if you like, the hazard of a chemical. And in some ways, that's the starting point in Europe for deciding we're going to take an action. There's no point putting a lot of effort into a chemical that doesn't have a particular hazard. And the focus is on those that are the significantly substances of very high concern. And the ones that fall into that bracket now in particular are those that cause cancer, those that cause reproductive effects, And more we're seeing them that those that cause particular impacts on the environment, so whether it's persistence and toxicity, mobility, and more now into endocrine disruptors. So we're beginning to expand how we look at chemicals and how we classify them. And when we do our work, we kind of, in this top corner, we get registered substances, we get information on the substances. We might evaluate it, either looking at it, the substance itself, because there's some particular concern with it, or looking at the whole submission to make sure that what the company said they were doing and the information they had and what they were producing was correct. So that can be either what we call a compliance check to make sure all the information is in place. And if it isn't, then we may ask them to do particular studies. But down here really is the key part for, I suppose, action, where we can decide either, first and foremost, that we're going to harmonise the classification. So if we see particular data which says a substance is causing cancer or it's an effect in the environment, we can then propose a classification. And that becomes the standard right across Europe. And the key here is because then it moves into all the other places it's worked at. So if you're classified under this rule, then you become, if you go into a medicine or if you come into a pesticide or a biocide, we all use the same classification and then it must be looked at the same across the board. We take account looking at things around identifying substances of high concern. So we have a method for that where we identify, as I said, CMRs and others. And then, of course, we can go down to authorise those particular chemicals if, in particular, we want them to continue use, but we want to push for substitution. So they must be used. And this is where you look not just at the hazard, but you're also looking at socioeconomic, technical feasibility, availability of alternatives before you decide whether they can be authorised or not. And then, of course, we have our restriction, which can be a ban, a full ban, a partial ban, or whatever in between. So it's quite a significant, I suppose, scope of things we can do. And we have, over the years, done quite a bit of work in relation to ensuring that as much as possible we're able to take action in relation to those chemicals that are particularly concerning. And say, for example, more recently, you might have heard, we have done some restrictions, such as microplastics. That was a large body of work that has recently been agreed at an EU level. We are looking at bisphenol A's and similar substances. And we've done some things, say, for example, lead gunshot in wetlands. So there's been a number of recent actions being taken. And bringing it back to, that's what we have now and that's what we've been working with. And then obviously the challenge came in the EU Green Deal, if you recall, and there was this push to have, I suppose, it's this idea of a zero pollution Europe. And part of that zero pollution was a chemical strategy for sustainability. And there the driver is to have a, if you like, a toxic-free environment so that you end up working with chemicals that are not going to be harmful to the environment, to the health, but are being used in ways that are both long-term viable and sustainable, but are also helping to move into the green transition as well. And it probably, as you know, the Green Deal came at a time, we were in the middle of COVID when it came out, strategy for chemicals also came out in 2020. And then we thought COVID was probably the worst you could get. And then we got lots of things with Ukraine and energy concerns. Then we got the climate, we have biodiversity. And we've so many things coming at us and issues now that more and more the importance of the choices people make for the chemicals they choose to use in their products, whatever those products are getting more and more important. And we're trying to make sure that we're pushing people to the end, I suppose, of being a circular, sustainable economy and making sure that products are being developed that, if you like, step away from those chemicals that we know have issues and continue to cause problems. So the chemical strategy for sustainability, again, just at a high level, it kind of had these 5 kind of pillars and there's different layers in it. It was about innovating for safe and sustainable chemicals, strengthening legislation, simplification, coherence, knowledge and science, and global. Well, what does that mean? Some of the things here are about, for example, banning the most harmful chemicals in consumer products and only allowing use where it's essential. We were looking at the cocktail effect of chemicals. Very few people, other than maybe in a manufacturing process, use a single chemical. We all use products, we all use multiple types of chemicals. So how do we bring that multiplicity of exposures into when we assess a chemical risk? We were talking about phasing out PFAS, and I have a few slides about that in a moment. But also being aware that interesting when you look at chemistry, those of you who are chemists will know this, obviously organic and inorganic, but where does all the organic chemicals come from? Well, they usually come from fossil fuels, which, if you like, are a challenge. And that's a huge challenge for Europe's chemicals industry and the world's chemicals industry. How do you start to transition away from using that as your base to more sustainable, longer-term chemicals? And as you know, some of the chemicals we have now have a huge benefit because they're the ones that could make the difference from us changing to a green economy. You all know about lithium in batteries and the whole, move to EV vehicles. But, from a classification perspective, lithium isn't a great chemical and it's been hazardous and we're classifying it. So we have this constant push and pull of we need to protect health and the environment, but at the same time we have to recognize the bigger picture of things around there. And this might be an interesting one, is this idea of one substance, one assessment, because often, as I say, for me, chemicals don't do borders. It doesn't matter where in the world they are. If you're persistent in Europe, you're persistent all around the world. My regulation may say it differently, but the chemical itself is going to act the very same. And more we see across Europe divergence perhaps in how we assess a chemical. And that could be because of different ways we develop our guidance, our different expertise and inputs, and also the legislation we have. And Europe is trying to account for that by bringing us together earlier on to be able to, if you like, look at a substance and decide this substance has this is the assessment. And they're doing that now in the classification, labelling and packaging regulation, CLP, where they're trying to harmonise upfront endpoints such as endocrine disruption for health or for human health and the environment, or persistence or mobility, because at the moment those classifications are downstream in other legislation, so therefore you get a difference of opinion and you can maybe have other perspectives coming in terms of whether it's classified or not, when it really should be based just on hazard information and, I suppose the toxicology itself. And as I said, there's quite a good bit of work going on, and probably one of the most, biggest chemicals out there, and I think I saw something coming in about microplastics and other chemicals, but this is obviously the forever chemicals that we have a whole PFAS group. And the concerns around them come from many different ways. They're bioaccumulation issues, mobility, long-range transport, they accumulate in plants, they have effects on human health and ecosystems, endocrine activity and mixture effects. So they're pretty wide-ranging in the concerns that they have. And as I said, the problem with a lot of chemicals is sometimes it's the chemical itself, or sometimes it's the way it degradates. And you can see here that this comes as well either directly from the chemical or indeed from their degradation to other persistent PFAS. And the persistence is due to this strength of carbon-fluorine bonds. So from a chemist perspective and from a manufacturing perspective, they do a really good job, but they're designed to be there. But unfortunately, it's a classic case of unintended consequences. The job that they were developed for is now the reason that they're causing all the problems we are seeing worldwide and not just in Europe. And we see them everywhere that they're tested for, and they remain in the environment for decades or centuries. And while I said, there is quite a lot of existing regulation in the EU, so some of them are already subject to or pending restrictions from us under the REACH or the persistent organic pollutant regulation in the EU. So that's where we look at them and stop manufacturer use. And those are some of the names there, the PFOS, the PFOA. They were done some years ago. Some we've identified as a substance of very high concern, which means they could be in the future authorised for use, and those are some of the details there. And then some of them where we're looking for more information, so they're undergoing what we call substance evaluation, or they're going to be classified under classification and labelling regulation. So there is a lot of work being done on them. And I suppose one of the challenges about substances, perhaps from a regulatory perspective, over the years we've probably spent a lot of time maybe on doing substances one by one, sometimes in a group, but that takes time naturally. The regulation itself takes time. So there's more and more emphasis being put now on actually looking at substances in groups, so chemicals as groups rather than individually, so we can take action. And the work we're going to be doing on PFAS is a very good example of that. So at the moment, we're almost through the final process in the agency, which is analysis of socioeconomic, and the opinion, I think, has just been wrapped up. This is looking at PFAS in firefighting foams, a very specific use, and it's covering a whole class of them, but as I said, very much so in a particular use, and it hits across a lot of different sectors. And this will ban formulation, placing on the market and use with sector-specific, time-limited derogations, and additional risk management measures may be required. And this is an example of the way we restrict. Now, obviously, we put that forward as an opinion, and it goes through then the decision-making process with colleagues in the Commission, the Parliament and the Council, Member States, to determine if that's agreed or not. And we always have to be conscious when we put a requirement forward like that there are, as I said, can be very immediate consequences, and we have to be able to address them. And that's obviously where the decision makers make the decision as to what the derogation would be like and what length of time it should be. This is what we call the universal PFAS. It's one of our biggest ever restriction proposals we've ever had. It has 5 member states put it together. Normally, when a substance is being proposed for restriction, there's 2 routes to that in Europe. A member state can do the work, or the agency, ECHA, as an agency, can be asked by the Commission to do that work. And we have, at the moment, under the Chemical Strategy for Sustainability, a restrictions roadmap, which is where we're putting a lot of effort into identifying and doing particular proposals. So this now targets a whole class of PFAS, covers all uses of PFAS. And basically, when we estimate the uses, this is about 4.5 million tonnes over the next 30 years. And the proposal is to ban manufacture, use and placing on the market for all these uses with an 18-month transition, which is relatively, that's the norm, it would be normally. Several use-specific, time-limited derogations, and other areas here where there might be time-limited derogations. And the reason I'm putting this up, I suppose, is twofold. One, to show that there is work going to be done. It will be complicated. Obviously, the bigger the proposal, the more work it takes to really look at it. It's massive. It covers all sectors, literally. And you still meet sectors who suddenly find out that they actually have PFAS in their use that they never thought before. And they're learning about where that is, and that's a challenge. And the other reason is to call out, at the moment, we're going through a public consultation. And what we'd like to say is that if you have any information or you'd like to contribute to that consultation, obviously we'd like to take that into account. And that's now running till September. So it's an important part of our process for getting information from not just industry, but from others who have it as well. And one of those parts is to talk about maybe alternatives or other information academics or others may have too that might help us make our opinion more robust. So in a way, quick whirlwind tour of what we're doing in Europe. We are, as I said, with the chemical strategy and sustainability, there's a lot of work going on out there. Some of it is going to, I suppose, directly impact what we're trying to do. So we have a CLP regulation has been revised, and that's currently going through decision-making. The REACH regulation itself is likely to be revised towards the end of this year. And that could be quite significant because it hasn't been looked at for many years. And things like mixtures factor, things like grouping of substances and streamlining the process to make it more robust and to get better data in will all probably be part of that. The Commission is also going to be releasing shortly an omnibus regulation which will reattribute what they call quite a few tasks across from the Commission into the agencies. And as an agency, ECHA are getting about 14 of those. So things like water will come to us, things like POPs and medical devices, and we'll start to have a more, if you like, fingers down the chain from simply the REACH regulation, which hopefully will add to this idea of a one substance, one assessment and a better alignment of legislation. And we're also across Europe looking at a big data regulation, which would have a European common data platform, where all the data that we have on substances from all the different regulators, academics and others can be there, not just as a resource, obviously as a resource for everybody, but equally as a means to understand more and use that data more productively to take the action where it's absolutely essential in as quickly and effective a manner as possible. So thank you very much.